They called him invisible because the city moved around him like a river and seldom noticed the man who kept the banks clean. Carlos Mendes learned the rhythm of being unseen the way some people learn a language, by listening, mimicking, and folding himself into the background until it felt natural. He knew which office lights would still be on at 2 in the morning, which vending machines hummed like sleeping animals, which elevators coughed and stopped on the 20th floor. He knew the smell of stale coffee that clung to boardroom carpets after a presentation, the thin sweetness of spilled wine at holiday parties, the metallic tang of coins in a change pouch. On most nights, the city looked kind to him because it didn't look at all. He put on a navy jacket that had seen too many winters, the collar worn smooth where he shrugged it on and off. He hooked his keys to his belt, slung a canvas bag across his shoulder with a thermos and a roll of trash bags, and slipped into buildings like a friendly shadow. Before he started his route, he opened a small notebook, its corners softened by his thumb, and read the single penciled line he had written one slow Sunday. Open a small neighborhood cafe. It wasn't a business plan. It was a promise. A tiny map folded into the page like a paper plane. He had been writing the same line for years, like a benediction. He kept a second list too. Smaller things that mattered. Rent, groceries, tuition for his niece when her mother needed help, a little fund labeled repair for the broken espresso machine in that impossible dream of his. At the bottom of the page, in a handwriting that blurred when he chewed the end of his pen, he tallied coins. He liked the ritual of laying out spare change on the palm of his hand and counting it slow, naming each coin like something that owed him a favor. Carlos moved through the night with a kind of patient attention that made small things large. He noticed the way a man folded his paper cup into a perfect cone. He found the single sock behind a couch and matched it with its partner. He learned to read spaces the way other people read faces. A chair turned too far away from the table, a folder placed inside a drawer instead of on top of it, crumbs in the corner where the cleaning light didn't catch. These were the tiny deviations humans left behind. They told stories, even if nobody else wanted to stop long enough to listen. That night, Meridian Enterprises' 43rd floor still had a few survivors of the company holiday party. Glasses balanced like small moons on side tables. Streamers dangled from light fixtures. The catering trays had been cleared, but a few napkins clung to the carpet like confetti caught in a static field. Carlos worked alone in the quiet, vacuuming an executive carpet the size of a living room, polishing smudges from a stainless steel coffee urn, picking up name tags that had been abandoned on cocktail tables. The building's HVAC made a low, constant conversation, and the fluorescent lights buzzed the way an old radio hums when nothing good is on. He moved into an office suite that had been rented by an outside consultant earlier that week, an arrangement that left closets unlocked and coat racks a little overcrowded. The room smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and perfume. He swapped the vacuum for a dust cloth and knelt to retrieve cocktail napkins from under a leather settee. When his hand brushed against a leather duffel tucked behind a potted ficus, he expected a sweater, a bottle, maybe a forgotten scarf. He did not expect paper. It was a small stack at first, the idea of paper like a whisper. An envelope slid beneath a corner of a manila folder. The envelope itself was plain, the flap tucked in, a gesture of haste or concealment he could not tell. On top of the stack, among catering invoices and generic receipts, were photocopied pages with heavy black type and red pen marks that seemed to underline numbers. One sheet had the ledger-like columns that bankers and accountants used, rows and rows of figures that marched down the page. Another had the name of a supplier he had seen on invoices before, but in different neighborhoods. A name that was a street address on its letterhead. A small USB drive rested on top of them, labeled in blunt marker, Q4 Docs. Carlos sat back on his heels before he could help himself. The room seemed to tilt for a heartbeat. The ceiling tiles blurred, the hum of the air system rose, and the smell of coffee shifted into something metallic. He was not an accountant. He was not a lawyer. He was a man whose hands knew how to buff a chrome banister until it reflected a strip of light like a blade. He knew, though, how things were supposed to sit inside an office. Invoices had headers. Checks had names. Payments went to recognizable vendors. These pages, this USB, did not make the same sense as the rest of the room. There were names repeated in strange columns. Addresses led nowhere he recognized. Several payments tracked to the same small company name he'd seen before, except the numbers beside them were big. So big they felt wrong by the way an empty glass feels wrong in a bar. He folded the leather duffel back into place, touching it as though to reassure himself it was solid. He didn't like touching what didn't belong to him. He had been raised to leave things as he found them. But this was not a lost sock. He took a breath, the way he always did when the city surprised him with something serious, long and measured, and reached for the small notebook in his pocket. He turned to the page where the penciled line sat, and though he had no business writing anything here, he traced the words with his thumb. In the margin, he wrote a single note, as if pinning his thought to the paper. Found papers. Suite, 43B. Later, he told himself. He knew what the rulebook said. Report what you find. Document it. Do not remove anything. Meridian's night staff had been given a pamphlet during orientation that mentioned lost property and workplace hazards and made the advisement to notify the on-site security team. He walked to the corridor and flicked on his radio. Night service. This is Carlos in 43B. I have found some documents. Security. Please advise. There was a rustle on the old speaker, and then a dry voice. Security, but not the kind that surprised him. Copy, Carlos. Stay put where you are. Can you bag them and leave them on the conference table? Carlos looked at the stack on his knees. Bag them? He thought of procedure like a lit fuse. Once you touched something, it had a trace of you. But he also knew the building's night crew was not the same as a detective with gloves. A manager might later accuse him of disturbing evidence. He clarified. Do you want them left in the room, sir, or should I escort a manager with me? Leave them there and make a note, the voice said. Fill out the found property log when you get the chance. Night supervisor will be in tomorrow morning. He hesitated. The log served bureaucracy, not necessarily justice. Leaving the papers in plain sight felt like handing a secret back to the people who might have hidden it. He had spent half his life balancing on that thin line between doing what was asked and doing what felt right. His niece's laughter came to him, quiet, bright, when he pictured what it would mean to lose his job over pride. Rent notices lined up in his head like dominoes. The notebook in his pocket was heavy with small hopes. He went back to the file with both hands. He took nothing out. He did not photograph the pages. He folded the stack together and set it on the arm of a guest chair, as if tucking a child into a blanket. He walked out into the hallway, step measured, and told the security desk what he had found. He said the words plainly. I found some documents in 43B that don't look right. They should be checked. The security agent who came 20 minutes later wore a badge warmed by a dozen other palms and the same cautious impatience that filtered through most overnight staff. He moved with the official slowness of someone trained to not offend the day shift or the executives who paid his wages. He bagged the papers in clear plastic, labeled them, and signed the log with a thick pen. He thanked Carlos, briefly, and offered the sort of gratitude that ends conversations, polite and empty of consequence. You're doing good work, man, he said as he went. Carlos watched the agent's back until it disappeared into the elevator, and then returned to the quiet of Suite 43B, as if the room might whisper another secret if he pressed his ear to its carpet. He had not expected anyone else to be watching him. He had expected, if anything, that his night work might be tidy and anonymous, and that, tomorrow, the office would be swept and ready for the daylight like a stage. Instead, He felt an ache of being seen without the comforts that sometimes came with recognition. There was a thin line between being noticed and being exposed. He lingered a moment longer in the doorway, fingers on the cool metal of the handle, and then moved on to the next assignment. The night had a routine to complete, a long list of small tasks that would make the morning tidy. He found Rosa in the loading bay, a compact woman with quick hands and a laugh that wound through the night like music. She had been with Meridian longer than anyone on the night crew, knew the security codes like a prayer, and she called Carlos by a name that made everyone close their mouths. Carlinho. They had worked shifts together for years. When she saw him, she raised an eyebrow and asked, "You looked like you swallowed a lemon. What's up?" He told her. Rosa's face changed, first into the public neutrality of a worker who'd seen squabbles, and then into the suspicion of someone who'd smelled trouble before. "Did you touch anything?" she asked, not to accuse, but to set the rules of the aisle he had entered. "Just moved them onto a chair," he said. Security took them and logged it. Rosa exhaled, a soft puff of air. "You did good. Sometimes the obvious is the most dangerous thing if you let it walk back out. But you did right." Another colleague, younger, named Ethan, neat hair, new badge, the kind of man who read policies like scripture, had a different reaction. He had shadowed Carlos often, learning the corners of the building, and everything in him clung to rulebooks. When Carlos told him how he had handled the papers, Ethan's eyes widened with alarm. "You shouldn't have moved them," Ethan said. "If there's an investigation, they'll want chain of custody. You could get pulled into this." "Isn't it better somebody finds out?" Carlos asked. "What if they needed to be found?" Ethan's face balled into a serious knot. "You always do the right thing, Carlos. But Meridian will cover itself first. Be careful. HR doesn't like surprises." There was truth in both replies, the moral and the pragmatic. He folded each into himself like second coats, warming and heavy. He left work that night with his navy jacket zipped up close, and the notebook pressed like a talisman against his chest. He walked the streets a little more slowly than usual, past closed bodega shutters and the corner where Mrs. Alvarez fed pigeons. When his phone buzzed in his pocket, he looked at the screen and saw a message from his neighbor, Anna. "Are you okay?" "I saw something on my feed." Carlos had not felt seen before, not like this. The idea of being on the edge of a lens made him uneasy. He sat on the stoop outside his building, opened the notebook, and made a small pencil mark next to the penciled cafe promise. Counted courage. He didn't know what that meant exactly. He just liked the way the pencil scratched, the private way language could be folded into a margin and kept safe. He slept poorly. The city kept happening around his dreams, commuters brushing past his sleep while he leaned on a broom, fluorescent lights like a second sun. He woke with the same sense of things tipped just past the comfortable axis. When he walked back into Meridian the next morning, the lobby was already busier than his night shifts had ever allowed. Taxis idled, delivery drivers jostled for space, and the atrium that had been quiet when he came through the night before hummed like a kettle. At the security desk, a crowd had gathered, an employee with a phone in a hand that trembled, 2 junior staffers whispering in a corner, a manager on a call with a voice that tried to be even and kept rising like dough. Carlos recognized the ripple effect that moved through workplaces when something that was supposed to be private slipped into public knowledge. He had been a conduit for the rumor without meaning to be. "Morning, Carlinho," Rosa said, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. "You look like you haven't slept." He shrugged. The building's morning light painted their faces in clean, indifferent hues. "Just tired." The security agent who had bagged the papers the night before greeted him with a nod and a manila folder bulging with copies of the log. "We kept your note, Carlos," he said. "There's a statement form for you when you have a minute." Carlos understood what that meant. They were making sure the record had him in it. That could be protective. It could also be a way to tie a string around his neck. He went to the small, windowless room and filled out the form with careful handwriting. He wrote his name, the time, the items found. He added nothing unnecessary. A woman from HR took the form with the practiced patience of someone who knew how many papers a company could spin out into the air as a defense. "Thank you for your vigilance," she said, voice calibrated for all possible responses. "An internal audit will be notified, and legal will be informed. For your safety and to preserve the integrity of any investigation, we ask that you don't discuss this matter externally." He caught himself wanting to say, "But I wasn't trying to be a hero. I'm just doing my job." Instead, he nodded. The HR woman's eyes were sympathetic in the way of people whose job required sympathy not to become policy. She did not promise anything. She would not cross that line. The first online clip appeared before he could finish his second cup of work-issue coffee. A junior analyst had filmed him bending into Suite 43B, hands on a chair that now held a plastic bag full of documents, and had posted it to a private company channel that turned public, as if it were an open window. The video was brief and casual. No commentary, just the angles of a phone camera balanced on a keyboard. In the clip, Carlos looked small and concentrated, the navy jacket a boat against the tide of beige carpet and glass. Someone had added a caption. "Janitor finds suspicious docs." Thoughts? It was not malicious, not yet. It was only a recording, a small thing that carried an idea. Still, phones started to buzz across the building like flocks of startled birds. One of the messages was from a neighbor. "Saw you on feed. Is that you?" Another was from a cousin making a joke that tried to be supportive. The HR woman asked Carlos if he wanted someone to accompany him whenever he had to be in that area for the rest of the day. He said no, that he was fine. She made a note anyway. When afternoon came, the story stepped off the internal channels and into the street. A local blogger who wrote short, sharp pieces about the city's late-night workforce picked up the clip and posted it with a headline that read, in part, "Night worker finds what might be a big problem." Comments piled on. Some cheered him for noticing. Others were suspicious. Why would a janitor be cleaning in the executive suite? A question shaped by assumptions more than fact. The clip spread to a neighborhood feed and then to a staffer's personal account with a caption that made Carlos uncomfortable. "This guy just changed everything." That line glowed like a kind word and weighed like a verdict. Carlos learned sooner than he wanted that attention could be both armor and heat. By the second day, people he had never met were messaging him with offers and warnings. A woman from a neighborhood collective sent a private message. "If you need anything, groceries, rent, anything, we've set up a fund." City council aides called to ask if they'd arrange a meeting to learn more. A reporter from a local station requested an interview and left a voicemail asking if he'd be willing to speak on camera. He listened to the messages, not knowing whether to be flattered or afraid. He had not asked for this. He had only done what he'd been taught, pick up what didn't belong and say something. And inside Meridian, the mood hardened. Management spoke the language of liability and confidentiality. There were memos circulated with the kind of bureaucratic sugar that tries to replace accountability. Meridian takes reports seriously. We will cooperate with investigators. There were also hushed conversations in glass-walled conference rooms, and the clang of doors closed a little faster than usual. The age-old instinct of an institution to shield itself appeared in forms both gentle and cold. Offers of legal counsel to certain employees, notices to restrict access to certain floors, and a sudden, very human urge to control the narrative. Employees who had hung up holiday streamers the night before now found themselves replaying their words, worried that an offhand joke might be used to paint the whole company as incompetent. Carlos had expected an investigation. in the way a person expects rain if the sky is iron gray. He had not expected to be swept into managerial measures that felt punitive. On his third day at work, he was told to report to the Human Resources Office. The HR woman's face, the one that had given him the form days before, was a neutral map of professionalism. A manager sat with a stack of papers that looked like a barricade. He offered handshakes that fizzed with nothing. "We appreciate what you did," the manager began. "But out of an abundance of caution, we need to place you on administrative leave while the audit proceeds. It's standard practice to protect both the employee and the company." Carlos heard the words but felt them like a hand closing around his chest. Administrative leave was a polite phrase that could mean different things. Paid time off while the company sorted facts, or a way to move a human out of the frame while the institution moved its chess pieces. His rent clocked in his head. He had been the fallback for bills and small miracles for a long time, and even the idea of losing a week's pay made him imagine up-ended dominoes again. "Is it because I did something wrong?" he asked. The manager looked at him with the softest possible sorrow that HR allowed. "We're trying to make sure the investigation is impartial. It's not a disciplinary action at this stage. It's precautionary. You'll remain an employee on the roster." Ethan's earlier warning echoed. Carlos felt the old familiar knife edge, doing right, being punished for doing right. He pocketed his notebook like a shield and left the office with a paper letter of confirmation and a numbness that felt like the aftershock of a storm. The camera that had caught his folded hands in Suite 43B had not stopped filming. Footage resurfaced online, trimmed and reposted by someone chasing engagement. A new clip showed him signing the security log, manufactured proof of narrative, and an overlay of commentary that posed a question he could not answer for himself. Why did a night cleaner find what auditors supposedly missed? The insinuation tugged at how the internet liked to frame stories. Someone should be blamed. Sometimes, the story demanded villains because it could not hold more complicated shapes. A different kind of attention crept in, too. A handful of people in the neighborhood recognized him from photos and stopped him in the bodega to offer him a sandwich. A woman who worked at the daycare 2 blocks away brought him a thermos of soup. A friend of his niece's family texted a link to a small crowdfunding page that had been set up by strangers. No request from him, no understanding of what money could mean in the middle of an investigation, only the reflex of community. The fund had modest donations at first, $20 here, $50 there, but the thought of it made him feel like an exposed tooth or a lifted hat. He did not know whether to accept the kindness or to push it away, lest he appear to exploit the moment. Meanwhile, a different logic played out inside Meridian. Legal counsel advised caution. Executives met with accountants who spoke in numbers like incantations and suggested soft public statements that wouldn't admit to discovery or wrongdoing, only to cooperation. The company issued a short press release that thanked its night staff for vigilance and told the public an audit had been initiated. The phrase internal review floated through the feeds like a mist. It didn't say much, but it said enough to slow investigative curiosity and feed speculation. Carlos watched all of this from the edges as the world tried to name what he had found. He kept reading the same pages in his small notebook. The cafe plan, the coin tally, the list of things he needed to fix around his aunt's apartment. In the margins, he imagined a counter behind which he could stand and make coffee for people who had once been invisible like him. He thought about how the community that started a modest fund for him might instead better be invested in programs that meant night workers had dignity, safe transit allowances, a city hotline for reporting irregularities anonymously, training sessions that would give staff a chance to be heard without being penalized. The thought of turning attention into something durable felt like fitting words into a grammar that mattered. 2 days after he had found the papers, 2 men arrived at Meridian in neat suits with plain cars and the sort of quiet that made less noise than the building's own air vents. They bore credentials and a patient manner. They were not at first the red banners of scandal. They were the slow, procedural slow dance of auditors and investigators. They asked questions. They looked at copies of the pages Carlos had found. They asked him what he remembered, and he told them the truth. Where he'd been, how the duffel was tucked, how the USB had been labeled. He watched them listen and take notes with a kind of soft craftsmanship. They did not make pronouncements. They treated the documents as if they were fragile things given to care. A week into the investigation, Meridian's PR released another statement. Still no judgments, only an acknowledgement that irregularities had been identified and that external auditors had been engaged. For Carlos, that phrase was a relief and a warning. Irregularities could mean bookkeeping errors. Irregularities could mean something more deliberate. He kept saying to himself, evidence that triggers an investigation. That was the language he'd been taught by the DNA of civics and the cautiousness of the world. The pressure of public attention had not cooled either. The original clip had grown like an onion peeled layer by layer, each repurpose of the footage reframing him. The local blogger ran a piece that humanized him, a careful portrait detailing his notebook and his niece's crayon drawings. The piece struck a chord. Donations to the neighborhood fund ticked higher, and a small coalition of community organizers contacted him, asking if he'd speak at a meeting about night worker protections. He said he might. He did not yet believe his voice could move beyond the slurry of rumor. An invitation came from a small, independent reporter who wanted to meet him at a cafe across from the municipal building. The reporter asked questions that were simple and sharp. How did you feel when you saw the papers? Did you feel afraid? What did you think might happen? Carlos answered the questions with a quiet truth. He had felt something like a responsibility that he could not name. He had also felt small in a way that made his chest ache. You did the right thing, the reporter said at one point. Not everyone would have. Maybe not, Carlos said, but the right thing isn't always the easiest thing. Sometimes it's the most dangerous. They both knew what he meant. Being visible in a place that preferred its workers to be invisible could make a person the focus of institutional unease. It could also make someone a story. The line between being a person and becoming a symbol was thin and often invisible until someone else framed it. Back at Meridian, HR had drafted an outline for an internal policy review that would, in time, examine how items found by night staff should be handled. It was a start, thin as a first draft. The management team debated whether to make the policy public. Some argued transparency would show accountability. Others warned that too much disclosure would create liability and embolden media coverage. Carlos overheard bits of the debate as he passed a glass office. Words like contingency and risk profile rolled around like a policy ball that everyone wanted to kick, but no one wanted to hold. A colleague from the night crew called him one evening. "They're talking about you in the staff lounge," she said. "Some want to buy you a coffee. Others think you're trouble. It's complicated." "It always is," he said. He could have ducked into the anonymity of a broom closet and refused the attention. He could have let the papers lie and avoided the press of conflict. Instead, he made a choice that was small and stubborn. He kept his notebook open and his pencil with a point. He attended the community meeting when the organizers insisted. He stood near the back and listened while city advocates talked about a hotline for night workers, and while a neighbor suggested a small fund for emergency pay so people placed on leave wouldn't go without rent. He agreed to let them collect signatures for a petition. The ideas were tentative. They had gaps, but they were anchored in the thing he'd wanted all along. Visibility with support, the small cafe, a space where night workers could be seen in daylight and in their own time. That week, As Meridian's external auditors went through files and the company moved its chess pieces in private rooms, a different kind of private began to swell around Carlos. A child from the building drew him a picture of a man behind a counter with a steaming cup and tacked it to his mailbox. An elderly neighbor handed him a knitted scarf in case it gets cold on the lot. A woman left a note. "We owe you one. If you need anything, call." These gestures were not enough to undo the cold bureaucracy that had put him on leave. They were not replacements for paychecks. But they warmed him in a way that made the night seem a little less dark. One afternoon, as he sat on a stoop, counting coins like an age-old prayer, his phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the Meridian legal office. They wanted to schedule an informational meeting with him. The subject line felt neutral, designed to comfort and to close. His chest tightened. He folded the navy jacket around his shoulders like armor he did not remember putting on and walked toward the place that had spilled his life into the open. He did not know then the full shape of the consequences he had set in motion. He did not know if the papers he had found would lead to a public reckoning, to fines, to resignations, or simply to a rearrangement of organizational furniture. He only knew the small, durable facts, the pencil in his hand, the warmth of a donated thermos, the heavy punch of the coin tally. He knew the notebook line that had turned into an engine, "Open a small neighborhood cafe." He felt the possibility that his quiet work, done night after night, had become something that made the company and the city look at itself in a new way. That evening, a camera light glowed in the window of the building across the street, and a reporter framed a question in a voice practiced for a broad audience. On the sidewalk below, someone had pinned a bright, hand-lettered flyer advertising a candlelit vigil for the city's invisible workers and a small community meeting to discuss night shift protections. The flyer fluttered in the wind like a small flag. Carlos stood at the corner and watched headlights carve the road. The notebook in his pocket felt like a small weight of possibility. He did not know whether the papers he had found were the first domino in a long tumble, or simply an aberration that would be smoothed over. He only knew that he had acted because the city's seams had shown him a tear, and he could not pretend not to see it. As the evening deepened, his phone vibrated again, this time a stream of messages from neighbors and a quiet note from Rosa. "They're talking about your leave." "Stay strong," she wrote. "Remember, you're not alone." He put his hand into his pocket and touched the pencil that rode beside the cafe promise. The city around him hummed, lights bobbed, distant sirens stitched themselves into the night. For the first time in a long time, his plan felt less like an impossible castle and more like a blueprint that could be handed across a table. He wondered what the next days would look like. Meetings that smelled of coffee and nervous breath, the slow, patient work of auditors turning pages, the brittle words of PR statements, and perhaps, if luck and community and a stubborn honesty aligned, the possibility of reshaping something larger than himself. He walked home with his navy jacket against the wind. When he reached his building, he paused at the mailbox, where the child's crayon drawing still clung, curling at the corners. He smoothed it with the back of his hand, and for a moment allowed himself to imagine a counter with a brass plaque, the hum of conversation, the smell of coffee that meant home. The next morning, there would be more questions. The building would call him into another room, a different manager with a different fear. There would be talk of policy and liability, of audits and investigations, all the machinery that turns a small discovery into a public event. He opened the small notebook, and under the penciled cafe promise, he wrote another line, quieter and steadier. Keep seeing. If this kind of story matters to you, if the quiet work that keeps a city running feels like it should be seen, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this one unfolds. The meeting room smelled of reheated coffee and the kind of confidence that comes from practiced sentences. Carlos sat with his navy jacket draped over the back of a spare chair, his notebook folded in his lap like a small talisman. Across the table, A woman from Meridian's legal department explained, in language designed to protect and to calm, that they wanted to go over the sequence of events. His statement, the log, the chain of custody as it stood. A young man with a tablet scrolled through a timeline that felt to Carlos like a map he didn't recognize. Timestamps, elevator logs, who had swiped into what floor and when. "We appreciate your cooperation," the legal woman said. "This helps the auditors. Please understand, as part of our process, we may need to ask you for further clarification." Carlos nodded. He listened and answered when asked. His voice was quiet, the way someone speaks when they wish the world would simply be kinder, not louder. When the meeting broke up, he walked out into the corridor and felt the office air fold around him like an indifferent sheet. He tried to read the small pencil marks he kept, a habit that steadied him, but his hand shook. He put the pencil back behind his ear, as if that would hold things in place. The external auditors arrived with briefcases and a calm that belonged to people who had learned how to look without astonishment. They did not act like story hunters or like outriders for blame. They asked for copies, for access to files, and for a chance to compare ledgers. They followed paper the way some people follow birds, careful, patient, until a pattern revealed itself. Carlos watched them move through the building, speak to staff in offices that went quiet when they entered. He learned to pay attention to their small rituals, the way they checked a header, compared names, noted when a bank address appeared multiple times against invoices for services that had no obvious office to show for them. When they asked him to describe the duffel again, he told them exactly how it had been tucked behind the ficus, how the USB had a blunt marker label reading Q4 docs, how the photocopies had red pen marks, how a supplier name repeated in ways that felt wrong. He did not try to explain the sums on the pages. He said enough to place his presence there. That, he thought, was what he could manage. The auditor's early findings were careful and slow, but they were not empty. They used language like repeated transfers and non-standard vendor arrangements, words that had been written in his notebook in a different life, words he would have once shrugged at, until they started to sound like soft bells. Meridian released another statement that week. An acknowledgement that external auditors had identified irregularities and that the company pledged to cooperate with any further inquiry. It was careful. It was not a verdict. But to the people in the neighborhood feeds, it read like the outline of something larger. The press picked up the shape of the story, not as a single, clean line, but as a tangle. Headlines asked questions that had no simple answers. The local station that had once only covered potholes and school board meetings sent a camera crew to the corner where Carlos boarded buses late at night. They filmed the stoop where he counted his coins and the mailbox, where a child's crayon drawing curled. For Carlos, the camera was a new kind of light, intense, probing, and oddly anonymous. People waved when they recognized him in the footage. Some looked at him like someone whose mistake they still needed to find. Within Meridian, the atmosphere changed. Conversations that had been easy hours before grew sharp with the sense of containment. Departments that had not known one another suddenly had to coordinate. Managers who once traded jokes in the kitchen now met behind locked doors. A handful of names were moved from one role to another. A few people were reassigned away from positions that interfaced with finance. The company insisted these were practical moves to ensure objectivity. The staff that remained whispered about scapegoats and about how companies rearrange chairs when the theater gets too hot. Those small human movements mattered to Carlos in a new way. He watched the ripple of the company's decisions as if they were birds skimming over a pond, patterns that could change the water's surface. He worried not only about his own wages, but also about the people who might be affected by the investigation. He thought of the receptionist who relied on the job to pay for her daughter's braces, of the driver who covered 3 routes and didn't miss a beat. He felt a responsibility that had nothing to do with ego. To ask that the story not become a weapon against ordinary people. Public attention, however, had its own logic. The crowdfunding page that had started as a neighborly impulse swelled week by week. Donations came in modestly at first, enough to buy a week's groceries for a family, a mid-month rent check for someone who was behind. Then the page grew beyond those small, urgent acts. Neighbors he had never met called to offer temporary jobs. A baker donated leftover pastries for a week's breakfasts. A group of young software developers proposed a short training clinic to help residents learn basic digital skills so they could manage fundraising pages and membership drives for community causes. The campaign organizers reached out to Carlos with an offer: immediate support for lost wages and a seed sum to start a community emergency fund for night workers placed on leave in the future. They explained how they'd designed the fund. Small, fast grants that could be released within 48 hours when someone needed rent or medicine or transportation. Carlos read the proposal and sat with the paper like it was a thing that might cut him if he squeezed it too hard. He had not wanted to be the center of this, but he had always wanted a place where night workers could rest under better light. And now, people were offering to turn their worry into something practical. He said yes, but not for himself. He asked that the organizers set aside half the seed money for training nights and a small community meeting space. He wanted a spot where the people who worked when others slept could learn how to report things safely, how to document what they found without risking their livelihoods, and how to access assistance without being forced into the limbo of corporate discretion. The organizers agreed. They named the fund the Night Workers Emergency Fund and added a small footnote: policy advocacy to follow. Advocacy was quiet work that required the patience Carlos had learned, sweeping carpets and counting coins. Community organizers arranged meetings with local advocates and a small group of council aides. They asked for a pilot program: emergency pay for workers placed on investigatory leave, transit vouchers for late-night shifts, and a public hotline for reporting workplace irregularities with an anonymous option. The municipal officials at first spoke in cautious tones, the sort that measure political risk, like wind direction. But when the meeting room filled with people who had worked the late shifts for years, their faces showed the kinds of cost the city sometimes ignored. Missed family dinners, long walks home, children left with neighbors when extra income fell through. A city aide proposed a limited pilot, a modest emergency stipend to be administered by a non-profit partner, and a study into how night shift workers could report concerns safely. It was not sweeping legislation. It was not a guarantee. But it had the virtue of being something that could be done quickly, without the long arc of bureaucracy that often smothered ideas. Community leaders called it a start. Carlos thought of that small start like the first brick in a wall, enough to notice, not enough to be proud of. The auditor's report arrived in a form of sober announcement. Several irregularities in vendor payments had been identified, and some transfers required further investigation. The report did not assign criminal intent. It did not declare guilt. It did, however, lay out patterns that demanded answers. Meridian released a statement promising full cooperation with investigators and making a pledge to improve internal controls and vendor vetting processes. The tone was corporate and earnest, the sort of voice that tries both to console and to preserve. There were no cheers, only a public acknowledgement that the neatness of the company's accounts had frayed. As the days lengthened, the neighborhood's attention remained steady. The fundraiser had met its first goal, enough to cover Carlos's lost wages for the months he had been placed on leave, plus a modest initial reserve for the Night Workers Emergency Fund. The campaign gathered a second, quieter round of support, framed less as a clamor for justice and more as an investment in people who kept the city running in the dark hours. A local credit union agreed to offer a low-interest microloan program for community projects. They met Carlos at the library with brochures and earnest smiles, and explained how a small loan could be matched by community donations to make a shop possible. Carlos sat across from the credit union officer at a table inside the library, his hands folded, the notebook open between them. He had thought about the cafe for years as a private promise. Now it felt like a shared idea that needed a different architecture. A place that would not simply sell coffee, but would be a safe space for the night community. A place open at hours the daytime economy sometimes ignored. He sketched a map on the back of an old receipt, where a bookshelf could sit, where donated tables might go, how the counter might face the street so people coming off buses could always find a lighted place. He named it softly, in a way that fit his modesty. The night table. The loan officer looked at the sketch and then at the crowded page of signatures from the neighbor fund. "You have a good case," she said. "It won't be lavish, but it will be real." They planned carefully. They chose a storefront 3 blocks from the bus line, a gutted space that smelled of old paint and potential. Volunteers painted walls, sanded counters, and installed a second-hand espresso machine a neighbor had found at a closing cafe. People donated mismatched chairs and a counter reclaimed from a church sale. Rosa negotiated a discount with a local baker who donated pastries for opening nights. Ethan, who had once warned Carlos about policy like a shield, showed up with a hammer and a quiet apology in his hands. The night crew came together in ways Carlos had only ever seen when the building's elevators went on the fritz. Quick coordination, practical jokes, and a lot of pizza boxes. Meanwhile, the company continued to adjust its internal procedures. They published an updated protocol for handling found items, including better chain of custody measures and a guaranteed rapid response by an on-call auditor for cases where a night worker raised a potential financial concern. The policy did not appear out of a single vow to transparency. It was the product of external scrutiny and the pressure of public opinion. It had gaps. It had clauses written to limit liability. But it also had a paragraph explicitly recognizing night staff as frontline observers and promising to make reporting safer and clearer. It was the kind of accommodation that begins imperfectly and might, with attention, grow into something sturdier. Carlos watched these changes with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. He had learned to breathe around institutional promises, to be grateful for small things, but to hold larger expectations with patience. He met with community groups and city aides and talked about the reality of being a night worker, the hours, the invisibility, the fear of being blamed for things one had only noticed. He spoke plainly. He watched faces in the crowd. The daycare worker with grease under her nails, the transit driver with a tired eye, a young man who had worked 2 part-time night jobs to keep his place in school. When they asked him to speak about courage, he answered with a different word: responsibility. "We are not heroes," he said once in a small packed room. "We're people doing our jobs. We need support for that." The day they set the first training night at a modest community center, Carlos felt a distracted sort of pride. The room smelled initially of cheap fluorescent bulbs and the heavy coffee from the pot someone had plugged in. A local non-profit had designed a session that taught basic documentation practices: how to note dates, how to photograph without jeopardizing an ongoing matter, how to report concerns anonymously if needed, and where to get emergency pay when administrative leave meant rent couldn't be met. The trainers were practical, and they spoke without jargon. Night workers trickled in, some curious, some skeptical, all tired. The session lasted 2 hours and ended with a simple thing no one had budgeted for: a round of shared stories. People spoke about close calls with broken elevators, about the time they found a leaky pipe that could have ruined a floor, about the oddities that made their work half cleaning and half vigilance. The relief in the room was gentle and human. It was one of those small, real moments that make a policy more than a memo. As Meridian settled into its new controls and audit teams continued their work, the company also began a small, reluctantly public campaign in which executives spoke about lessons learned. They made donations to the Night Workers Emergency Fund as a sign of good faith. The donations came with careful language. They were not a confession. Yet their act allowed the fund to help not just Carlos, but others in need. The fund paid emergency rent for a reception worker who had been ill, covered medication for a driver who had been injured, and provided a small grant for an employee who had to travel for a sick relative. These were quiet acts. For many, they were the difference between sleeping that month or staying awake in worry. The legal outcome of the auditor's inquiry was not a sudden cliff. It was a slow, bureaucratic process that mapped how far the irregularities had rippled and who had the authority to answer for them. Investigators asked for records, for interviews, for bank statements and signatures. Meridian cooperated, sometimes with visible reluctance, sometimes with a clear desire to control the narrative. Eventually, the company announced that the audit had identified serious accounting irregularities and that they had referred certain matters to external investigators. The phrase, serious accounting irregularities, landed in the press like a bell. Friends of Carlos cheered in small ways. One neighbor baked a cake and left it on his stoop. Carlos paid attention, but he refused to let the news swallow the work happening in the neighborhood. He focused instead on the small steps he could take. The night tables build-out was a community project more than a business plan. Volunteers painted a mural, an image of a table under a lamp, people of different ages and uniforms sitting together. Someone donated a vintage clock that had once hung in a bus depot. Rosa found a brass bell that they used to call patrons in when the door was closed at midnight. They put up a corner shelf with donated books and a small bulletin board that listed support resources, numbers for the emergency fund, contact information for training nights, and a note that read, in handwriting Carlos liked, "If you work at night, this is for you." Opening day was not an event staged by PR. It was a morning where a line of neighbors waited for the first cups. The sign above the door was modest and hand-painted, the night table. Inside, the espresso machine steamed and hissed like a kettle that wanted to tell a story. Friends from the night crew took turns behind the counter. The credit union officer cut a small ribbon with someone else's scissors. A journalist who had covered the initial discovery took notes, but then bought a coffee and sat quietly in a corner. A child brought the crayon drawing that had been on Carlos's mailbox and handed it to him with the solemnity of a small ambassador. Carlos pinned it behind the counter, next to a brass plaque that read, simply, "For the people who keep the night safe." It was not a grand dedication. It was small and precise, the sort of honor that did not seek to rewrite an ordinary life. The cafe's doors opened to people who had been where Carlos had been, sleepless, overlooked, indispensably present. He learned quickly the shape of his days after the opening. Mornings brought the regulars who worked early and liked strong coffee. Nights were for the cleaners and drivers who wanted a place with light and a friendlier face than the darkness outside. He instituted what he called safety nights. Once a week, the cafe stayed open past schedule and hosted a casual meeting where night workers could swap information, sign up for the emergency fund, or simply rest without being judged. Sometimes a community organizer would drop by to discuss the hotline. Sometimes a city aide would come to listen. The cafe became, in small practical ways, a living room for people who had rarely had one. Carlos remained cautious about the attention that had found him. He declined most interviews that sought an angle. When cameras asked for the heroic version of the story, he deflected. "I found something," he would say. "I did what anyone should do, tell someone. People notice that and decide what to do with it." He preferred to point the microphone and the spotlight toward the fund, the training nights, and the new policy language. He wanted a durable change more than he wanted applause. Across town, Meridian continued to shuffle. Certain executives left the company, others were reassigned pending further review. The company increased its vendor vetting processes and announced a partnership with an outside compliance firm. It was hard, in the months that followed, to tell whether the changes would hold. Policies can be earnest and still brittle at the edges. But at the neighborhood level, the Night Workers Emergency Fund and the training nights were real. People used them. People were helped. The small victories mattered to those who received them in the dark hour when everything else felt uncertain. There were moments of friction, too. A clumsy article mischaracterized the night table as a charity spectacle. An online commenter suggested the whole event was stage-managed. Carlos read the comments and felt the old sting of being Mizine. He also received notes, handwritten letters, a loaf of bread, an offer from a retired carpenter to build shelves. Those gestures stitched the harder edges into a geometry that felt human. Months later, an assembly was held at the community center with a modest agenda. Celebrate the fund's first year and announce a formal partnership with a non-profit to administer the emergency stipend. A local council aide read a short statement about the pilot's results and announced that the city would, tentatively, extend a small line item in next year's budget to continue the pilot for night shift transportation vouchers. It was careful, almost apologetic language from officials who had learned to be cautious with promises. But the room applauded. Carlos stood in the back because being front and center still made him uncomfortable. He listened as neighbors who had once been alone in the night described how a small stipend had kept them from missing rent and how the hotline had helped another worker report a hazard without fear. The applause felt like a breath that filled the room. The day the audit's findings became part of a larger corporate and legal process, reporters came to the cafe. A camera loomed one slow afternoon as Carlos brewed coffee and counted tips. He served a regular who ordered the same thing every day, a black coffee with a dash of milk, and found himself answering questions he had learned to keep simple. "I don't know what happens in courtrooms," he said to a young reporter, "and I don't want to pretend. I know what happens at a table. People need places to be heard. They need to be safe when they say what they saw." The press liked the quote. Some people called him a whistleblower. Others said janitor turned hero in headlines and in breathless social posts. He found the language reductive and almost dangerous in how it erased the collective work that had made the program possible. He wanted the notice channeled. He wanted the story to leave behind practical things. A policy, a fund, a place where people who worked at night could count on a cup of coffee and a safe seat. 2 years after the duffel had been tucked behind the ficus, the night table had become a small, steady place with regular hours and a modest payroll. It also hosted training nights that taught practical documentation, basic financial literacy, and ways to navigate HR protocols. A corner of the cafe held a bulletin board where the emergency fund's small grants were posted once a month, anonymously, for privacy, with notes about how the money had been used. The brass plaque behind the counter had gathered fingerprints and a faint patina that felt, to Carlos, like the mark of a thing that had been used well. On quiet nights, as the city settled into a hush and the neon of storefronts went dim, Carlos still counted coins. He would lay them out on his palm and name them the way he always had, a small ritual that kept him connected to the arithmetic of living. When a child's drawing fluttered in the breeze, he would smooth it against the wall and trace the lines with the tip of his finger. He kept his notebook on a shelf behind the register. The penciled line, "Open a small neighborhood cafe," was still there, and beneath it he had written other lines. Funds set up. Training nights launched. Policy language added. He had written, too, in the margin the small injunction he had added on that first flurried night. Keep seeing. People sometimes asked him if he regretted speaking up. He thought about that for a long time. Regret would be an easy cloak, but it did not fit his hands. He had been scared. He had worried about rent and about the sequence of dominoes that could fall. He had watched the company shuffle and felt the small cost of doing the right thing. And yet he also saw faces at the night table who had been helped, who had not lost their apartments because of the emergency fund, who now knew a route to speak when something in their workplace seemed not to add up. He thought finally that the question of regret missed the point. It was not about a single decision. It was about what followed from it. There were quiet celebrations. The community organized a small plaque to mark the cafe's first anniversary and invited those who had supported the fund. The ceremony was not grand. A few speeches, a modest cake, a child's recitation of a poem about light. But it was exact. A woman who had donated early money read the first page of the fund's report and then handed the microphone to Carlos. He stood before a crowd of faces lit by string lights and said only what he believed. "Keep seeing," he told them. "If you notice something wrong, tell someone. We owe each other that." People clapped. The phrase folded into the room the way a quiet sentence can settle a crowd. A reporter recorded it and later turned it into a headline that read, in part, "Keep seeing, how one night worker helped change a neighborhood." That was flattering, and it missed the way the change had been slow and collective. But it also carried the kernel of a truth, the small insistence that visibility must be coupled with care. In the months that followed, the night table added a practical offering. Once a month, they hosted a legal clinic where volunteers from a local law school answered basic questions about workplace rights and about how to preserve evidence when necessary. They held a night each quarter where the Emergency Fund Board met publicly to approve grants. They added a small apprenticeship program where a young person could learn behind-the-counter skills in exchange for a modest wage and mentorship. The cafe had become, in a modest, functional way, a node in a safety network that had not existed before. Carlos remained himself, quiet, careful, attentive. He did not like being the center of attention. He liked instead the smell of coffee, the small ritual of exchanging coins and smiles, the way the door felt when it opened on a windy night and regulars came in like a familiar tide. He kept his navy jacket on the hook behind the door. He kept the child's crayon drawing behind glass above the bulletin board. He still counted coins when the night slowed and wrote a line or two in his notebook about the day's small victories. One night, long after the din of press coverage had quieted and the immediate tangle of the audit had moved into the slow churn of legal calendars, a woman came in who had been in the building the night Carlos had found the papers. She sat with her hands wrapped around a cup and looked around the cafe as if mapping who belonged to which table. "You were the one who found it," she said softly. "I wanted to say thank you." Carlos shrugged and smiled in a way that did not quite carry the weight she seemed to want to place on him. "I just did what felt right," he said. She nodded. "You changed some things," she said. "Not everything, but some things." "Some things is how most things begin," Carlos answered. He looked at the clock on the wall, the donated one from the bus depot, and then at the crayon drawing pinned under the glass. "Keep seeing," he added, and the woman repeated the phrase like a small blessing. As he closed the shop that night, he walked the familiar path of wiping down counters, stacking chairs, and making sure the tip jar was secure. He set his navy jacket neatly on the hook and slipped his notebook into his pocket. He took one last look at the bulletin board where the Night Workers Emergency Fund posted its monthly round of grants. Anonymous notes that read simply, "Rent paid, medicine supplied, transit voucher issued." He felt, in that small look, the shape of a life rearranged. Not in terms of fame or fortune, but in terms of the practical dignity that comes from not having to bear the cost of being seen. Outside, the streetlights smeared a quiet light across the pavement. The city hummed in its slow machine way. Carlos walked home feeling the exacting weight of his pencil behind his ear. At his stoop, he took out the small coin pile from his pocket and named the coins like a prayer, counting them the way he always had, a ritual that folded him back into the small arithmetic of his life. He opened his notebook, and under the penciled café Promise wrote, with a steadier hand now, another line. Keep seeing, keep building. If this story moved you, and you want to help night workers where you live, check the description for ways to support local initiatives, community funds, volunteer training nights, and resources that help night shift employees report concerns safely. Share this story with someone who might listen, and remember, sometimes the quietest work holds the clearest light.